So, we're in the special period after the Soviet Union collapse and the era leading up to it. So you might think about the different waves of Cubans leaving Cuba. The Operation Peter Pan, the Ana Mendieta was part of the Marisol boat lift, and then the Balsero crisis in the 90s will be the subject of today. And so, in a way, you could see this as maybe a pressure release. The idea of being able to speak to the ocean might be a way of giving you some kind of relief so that you maybe don't take that big leap into the water as a means of escaping Cuba, perhaps because it's a very dangerous journey filled with sharks and hurricanes and all the other kinds of dangers you would expect from just hurling yourself into the open ocean. Um, it's only 90 miles, which we could drive in like, what, an hour or less, or hour or more, hour and a half. But it's not a paved road, so it is a very really tragic era of Cuban history that all these Cubans perish in the water crossing the Straits of Florida, um, seeking some kind of asylum in the United States. So I think this installation piece really addresses that situation, and I think we need to kind of fill in the blanks in order to understand it better. But the rust I think is really powerful for me. It's such a beautiful object, and yet when you think about the idea that a microphone isn't plugged in and it's just sort of a monument of a microphone that's rusted, it really kind of takes away the whole idea of speaking, having a voice, and it becomes sort of like the anti-microphone, the opposite of a microphone. So let's go ahead and move forward and think about this idea of, adios utopia. This is an exhibit in the 1990s, and I think it captures that idea a lot of people were contemplating, which is the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cuban Revolution in the 90s, because people thought, well, the Cold War is over with Gorbachev's two-pronged policy, glasnost and perestroika, opening up the economy, opening up changing the political transformation, and a lot of people assume that's just the end of communism and or the Cuban Revolution as well. That will not be the case, and I think. Though you have to consider that a lot of people were anticipating the end of the Cuban Revolution in the 1990s, but Cuba makes some changes that I think give it a new lease on life. But perhaps it's just postponing the inevitable. And I think today that question, I think, hovers again, this idea, adios utopia, goodbye utopia. Utopia is a perfect society. The word utopia is from the Thomas More book. I'm pretty sure it's Thomas More, very short book, contemplating a perfect society. And the word literally means no place. So it's a perfect place does not exist, right? But to aspire for a perfect place is awesome, is just fine. But I think we all have to understand you never quite reach perfection, because then you're probably in heaven, I guess. So, this idea of saying goodbye to utopia is like a bittersweet kind of commentary on the end of an age, end of an era. And yet, as we know, the Cuban Revolutionary era hasn't quite ended, but it may very well likely be on its last sort of fumes, which is really sad for us, I think, because we're looking at a class about Cuban art, but maybe is a beginning of a happy era where there's some kind of changes. And it would be great if Cuba doesn't rely just on tourism, but has other, it's crazy to think that Cuba is like showered with sunlight throughout the year and doesn't have enough, solar power or wind power. But those things take money and investment. And with the US blockade or embargo, it's very hard for Cuba to create economic links with other countries without those other countries earning the ire of the United States, which we'll see with Venezuela, of course, the Soviet Union, and even today, perhaps with China potentially building military bases in Cuba, which is like a returning to the Bay of Pigs, a Cuban Missile Crisis, I should say, all over again. So, yeah, this, I think, idea of adios utopia could be a very fitting title for today's lecture, but maybe add a little dot, dot, dot. So, I think this exhibit here is a chance. It was basically people reflecting. I guess it was 2017. Sorry, not the 1990s. But either way, I think in the 1990s, people were already contemplating this idea of adios utopia. But in 2017, this would be, I think, in response to Fidel Castro's death. So Fidel Castro dies in 2016, and that is another moment where people are wondering, okay, maybe this is the end of the revolution. And as we've seen, Cuba and Fidel don't walk gently into that good night. They're definitely, clinging to power. And, the Cuban military owns most of the farms, most of the hotels, runs most of the tourism. So any kind of thawing of relations with Cuba and the United States, or with Cuba and the rest of the world, will have to go probably through the Cuban military and that sort of power structure. So it's a and of course, then you have the issue of the history with Cuban exile community wanting their property that was seized by the Cuban government back. Even companies that had their property seized by the Cuban government, the revolutionary government, Coca-Cola and others, might, want to litigate that kind of stuff in court. It seemed like enough time has passed that now a lot of those people, those stakeholders are very old, and perhaps lost a lot of that bitterness, that rancor that fueled their anti-Castro sentiment. And yet it's very hard to let go of, of those things. So it might just be a matter of more time needing to pass. The problem with that, though, is the Cuban people are the real ones suffering as time unfolds and as, the politics shifts. And that's why I think you see so many Cubans leaving, because so they've crossed that point of no return where paying any allegiance or showing any obligation to the Cuban Revolution, versus seeking a better life for your family. You really can't force someone to to put ideology and politics before basic necessities, right? So it would be crazy to ask someone to do that, right? So going back to this picture, in a way, this is, I think some of you argued this is a pro-revolution within the revolution, a kind of happy moment in the 1970s. And in some ways, it really was, at least just from that angle, because the 1970s was characterized by prosperity. The Soviet Union was funneling a lot of money into Cuba to maintain this adversarial relationship with the United States, having Cuba on our doorstep as a sort of pro-communist part of the Soviet bloc. And I think this picture is just the total opposite of the spirit or the feeling of Cuba in the 90s, where lying down in the grass is really sort of like the last thing people were thinking about doing in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse. So we've really, just it feels almost like right when we start talking about the Cuban Revolution and this first wave of artists, it's like already over right when it starts. It's like you go to a party, and as soon as you arrive, it's time to leave. And so that's not, the final word on it, but it's hard not to kind of think about how sort of short-lived this era is if the revolution ends. So, whether or not we're going to be looking at the end of the revolutionary era of Cuba or not is a really interesting question for me. And I don't think, it's not good to just maintain revolution if there's no kind of will by the people to maintain it. And of course, the Cold War is over, so you really have to think about, the relevance of the politics between the United States and Cuba, this sort of, I don't know if you call it vindictiveness or paybacks, or just wanting to save face, the United States wanting to show the world that we're not going to capitulate to a small little country next door to us. Seems a little bit prideful and arrogant, especially when we know that, there's a humanitarian crisis waiting to explode if Cuban people don't have enough electricity and food. So hopefully there'll be some kind of working together with other countries. I think Spain, Mexico, Russia, and the United States, and the Caribbean, because of the history between all those countries and Cuba, it seems like some kind of harmonious collective working together with those countries makes sense, to help with Cuba to shift to whatever the next era will be. Um, but I think that really it depends on Cuba and the internal power structures within Cuba, and we'll address those questions a little later. But I think you can appreciate this idea of reflecting on the end of an age of the Cuban Revolution. And so we're going to learn about this interesting artist, Glexis Novoa, who I wrote my master's paper about. Um, and this is a exhibit he did in Miami after he left Miami. Remember, a lot of Cuban artists flee Cuba, including this artist we'll see today, and he was a major figure in the performance art scene in the 1990s. I know you guys probably can't hear what we're going to hear, but you're going to see some subtitles, and I'll kind of relay what you're seeing here too. So it says an encounter between Fidel Castro and Glexis Novoa during a visit to Killing Time, a Cuban art exhibit at Exit Art, New York, June 11th, 2007. So keep in mind, this is not really Fidel Castro. This is someone playing Fidel Castro. So that makes it a wonderful tribute to the performance art era that Glexis Novoa was such a major contributor to. And this is also an homage, doing a performance of hiring someone to play Fidel is a wonderful way to bring that performance spirit to the United States in exile, to address that era of performance. And that's in fact what's going on. Fidel Castro is basically the person playing Fidel Castro is being given a guided tour by Glexis Novoa to see photographs from this era of performance art in the 1980s. And it's basically Fidel Castro commenting on the photographs, being typical Fidel Castro, kind of boastful, know-it-all, with access to, with tons of stories about how he met this person and that person, and it just kind of, I think the whole point is to lampoon Fidel Castro and make him seem somewhat obsolete or out of touch with reality. And I'll let you guys to decide if that's the case. So let's moving forward. So here we go.
Buenas noches, hermano. La verdad que le agradezco muchísimo que esté por acá, que haya dedicado su tiempo a
So the
pasar por
Fidel
aquí.
Castro, I mean, I think you can see he's already designed to be lampooned. He's wearing that jumpsuit. So before Fidel Castro died, there was a period of about, I don't know, 5 to 10 years where he would, instead of wearing the military fatigues that are so kind of connected to his aura, his sort of appearance, now he started wearing this jumpsuit. And so this is Glexis Novoa kind of mocking Fidel Castro for that jumpsuit, the Adidas jumpsuit he would wear. And obviously I think the white paint on his face is meant to just sort of make him look like a clown.
Realmente es un honor para mí estar en esta ciudad con tantas amistades y tantas personas que estoy convencido me quieren aún. Seguro, sí, comandante, claro.
So it says, of course, the Fidel Castro thinks everyone loves him. People who are very narcissistic, I think, always kind of feel that way. And, it's hard probably not to be a narcissist if you, become a leader in a country. You really have to remember how much of a bubble, if you become famous or become super successful or politically powerful, everyone only sees you as powerful or famous or rich, and you lose some of your humanity once that happens. Not always, some people can rise above that, but it's rare not to get inside a bubble of your own sort of vanity when you become super popular as an influencer, for instance. So I wanted to show you what is the section of Cuban performance in the 1980s. So
Aquí quiero enseñarles lo que es la parte de los 80, de performance en Cuba.
That's Alexis Novo on the left.
Y aquí tenemos este es el trabajo de Leandro Soto, que él trabajaba en la ciudad de Cienfuegos, donde él empezó a hacer estas cosas en la calle y a jugar con los
We
objetos
saw some work by Leandro Soto last week.
que salían del mar, del puerto. Me acuerdo perfectamente del trabajo de este muchacho impecable. Y creo que fue el que inició el movimiento. Sí, sí, comandante. Fue el que tengo memoria. Sí, es cierto, comandante. Totalmente.
It's very funny. It's very, I clearly, he gave Fidel Castro, the guy playing Fidel Castro, I think the bare bones of a script. He's told him, and maybe he's a Cuban exile himself who's, who adores the opportunity to make fun of Fidel, because this is something you could never do in Cuba. You would never get away with lampooning Fidel Castro in Cuba the way he's doing, which is, really too bad. But so this is something you can get away with in Miami. And the actor playing Fidel, I think, clearly has some kind of awareness of how Fidel is. Probably he's Cuban, the actor, or was given a kind of sense of improvisation to work within a kind of character.
Trabajo también en la Ceiba. No se me olvida. No hay problema. Estamos bien.
So let me just kind of skip ahead so you can kind of read some. So they're looking at some of these photographs. These are all, photographs from the 1980s. And they're looking at, basically he's showing Fidel Castro these pictures, and it becomes kind of what you might call a walk down memory lane, going through all these pictures, describing them to him. And now you can see the performance pictures from the performance art scene in the 1980s, which we'll be looking at. And Fidel Castro constantly just sort of has these little anecdotes, or to kind of acts kind of like a know-it-all, or or it seems to kind of not really understand the significance of what's going on, but kind of pretends to. And let's
Interesante trabajo.
he'll be addressing one of the artists we'll be looking at today, which is Robert Rauschenberg. I'm sure some of you, if you haven't heard of Robert Rauschenberg, I'm sure you've seen his work and don't know who it is. And he's a very important artist from the United States, and I think globally you would say he's a very important artist in terms of the art world, and we'll talk about him in a moment. And so here it says, yes, an important place for the whole revolution. This is the American artist Robert Rauschenberg.
Este es el artista americano, Robert Rauschenberg. And
And Fidel said, I know him well. A few times we spent up till 3 in the morning speaking. So that's a great example of this world famous American US artist, Robert Rauschenberg. And we'll talk about the circumstances why he was visiting Cuba in the late 80s in a moment. And he's basically saying, oh, yeah, I was up till 3 a.m. talking to Robert Rauschenberg. And, Fidel says that like kind of boastful. And that, I think, it goes back to what I was saying, that Fidel Castro has this access to these celebrities or VIPs or people who visit Cuba, but it's this unique access, and not every Cuban can stay up until 3 a.m. talking to Robert Rauschenberg. So it's kind of like you can feel that Fidel Castro's somewhat out of touch. He doesn't quite get it. He's not looking at the world from the ground level. He's looking down from the ivory tower, so to speak.
sí, debe ser hasta las 3 de la mañana, creo que hablamos. Sí, y esto es una obra de...
And we'll see today, Robert Rauschenberg and Fidel and Glexis Novoa will have a very important interaction between each other, which will be or was the subject of my master's paper, and we'll get into that soon. So I think these, showing baseball, one of the performance art pieces that they perform in the 90s is a baseball game. So a whole baseball game was actually a performance piece. And the idea of performance in Cuba is very interesting because, we looked at performance art as it relates to Ana Mendieta, Yoko Ono, and it's, there's a twist on performance in Cuba because, it allows you to use performance as a shield to dilute your own personal accountability. So if you do a performance, any critical response of the government will be spread equally among all the participants. And the more participants, the more diluted the accountability. So holding a baseball game as a kind of way of protesting using performance is a really powerful and very clever way of making art that doesn't wind up with you getting in trouble or ostracized or given the Antonia-itis treatment where you're sort of forced to go make paper mache for children. So I think artists discover that performance art is a very powerful tool in a time of, well, you think about even today, a lot of people are very critical of the current president and current administration. And so what are the tactics? What tactics can you use? Some people are going after cars, right? Going to Tesla cars. Some people are going to social media. And I do think that historically, satire and comedy are often really powerful ways of knocking down a few pegs anyone who is sort of has the arrogance of like a totalitarian leader. So I think in Cuba, when you think about what's an effective strategy to speak truth to power, I think using performance is a really powerful tool. Because you think about it, people, there's a kind of legitimacy to performing because everyone, you see a lot of people doing it, you think, oh wow, like protest, you see a lot of people protesting, there's a little bit of mofo, right, missing out. Yeah, I think that was the term. I think you were missing out, feeling like, oh, if these people are all doing something, I could be part of that. And so it's a very powerful strategy to speak truth to power by having strength in numbers. And I think a baseball game, likewise, is really clever. And so we'll see different examples of performance art in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And I do think it reaches some kind of boiling point, and maybe start to recoil in the 90s when we'll see one of the performance artists get thrown in jail. Now, Alexis Novoa avoided jail, didn't cross the line, but I think instead of crossing the line, he chose to leave Cuba. And so when I see this performance here, it's wonderful, but it's also a really bittersweet moment because Alexis Novoa is in the United States and really can't go back to Cuba because he chose to leave Cuba. So, like I said last week, that decision to leave Cuba is a one-way ticket. It's like burning your boats. Once you leave Cuba, the Cuban government leaves you. And so, and it's a really beautiful tribute to his time as a performance artist in Cuba in the 1980s, but also a very sad moment when you realize that Alexis Novoa is now sort of in his own, isolated in the United States, isolated from Cuba. So let's get back to the lecture, and so we'll look more at Alexis Novoa in a moment. Just understand that the reason why people leave Cuba in the 1990s really has to do with changes, global changes going on with the end of the Cold War. So Robert Rauschenberg in 1988 visits Cuba kind of right at the eve of the end of the Soviet Union. I think a lot of people could feel it in the air that there were changes going on, and also I think artists, and this is more true, the truer as I get older, that artists, and it's artists, and maybe if the only other group who might be before artists or maybe composers. Some musicians seem to anticipate or prophesize changes. It's like almost like a feeling or sensibility. And so a lot of ways artists are able to sort of be one step ahead of the politics. It's as if politics is downstream from art. And so Robert Rauschenberg, despite all of maybe the critics he has, is sort of this like Ana Mendieta, like bellwether, like arriving just before the storm. And so it is sort of this innocent moment where he, I think, thinks that he can single-handedly change the world with his art by going on this globe-trotting adventure where he visits countries like China, Mexico, the Soviet Union. I think he goes to Chile and, of course, Cuba as a way to bridge the divide between countries using art. And that is a very powerful tool. If you ever get into international diplomacy, art is a very important part of international diplomacy because it's this pressure release and it's a way of transcending differences. Art is and it's very, throughout history, that's true, that art is a way for people to kind of come together, to bring people together because, you're seeing something that doesn't necessarily depend on language or culture, or it might to a degree, but I think you can appreciate that art is this kind of nexus or a no man's land, maybe not a no man's land, a neutral territory where people can kind of come, that brings people together, right? So Robert Rauschenberg, at least, I think that thinks that by going around the world, he can sort of single-handedly end the Cold War, perhaps, and or at least diminish the animosity, the adversity between the Soviet Union and the United States, and maybe just sort of bring his art around the world, just as part of like a globalization of art. Whatever may be the case, he calls his journey Rossi. We'll look at the acronym in a moment. And his pet turtle, this pet turtle he had, became a kind of symbol of his journey and this organization he funds by selling a lot of his artwork. So he did, personally finance this journey. And this is the kind of style of art that he makes when he travels the world. And I think it makes sense because silkscreen is a pretty, it's one thing to collect objects to bring together and combine them. I think it's a little easier to use photography as the basis and then it's collage and silkscreen because it is kind of the next step beyond just sort of taking photographs. And it's a way to collage together things almost like memory, right? You bring different photos together and there is an element of memory or juxtaposing, contrasting colors and things that, bring their own baggage. And of course, if you're visiting a country and you're an outsider who doesn't speak the language, using your camera is a great way to talk to people if you don't speak the language, or just say, this is beautiful. The camera is a tool that says, I care about this, I care about that. I'm celebrating everything that I take a picture of. And then to look through those photographs, choose the ones that you like, put them together in this kind of collage is maybe not the deepest way of honoring the country you're visiting because it's a kind of like a tourist point of view, like fish out of water point of view, but it's certainly something. And I think, and I think it's the most you could expect from someone who isn't, a homegrown Cuban artist. What would you expect from someone, someone visiting your country for a week or two? I think this is the best you could probably get in terms of making art that is an outsider's view of the country. But I think we could agree it's very limited and absolutely will be subject to scrutiny by the host country nationals, especially if the artwork or the pictures or whatever, however they're arranged, or the scale seems out of touch with the concerns of locals in the country. And of course, that will be different depending on the country he visits. Either way, this is definitely the style or the execution or the kind of way of making art that he uses in these different countries he visited. So silkscreen photography and juxtaposing all those things together. And that's probably more effective. Well, he does have some examples where he does combine objects, but I think you could agree it's hard to maybe collect objects in another country. You might get into trouble. It might be, it's just a little trickier than maybe taking photographs. But I think he does a little bit of both. And, that's definitely straight out of the Robert Rauschenberg playbook. If I'm not going to teach you too much about Rauschenberg here, but I think you can see from his artwork, it really fits into this kind of late 20th century idea of combining everyday objects. It goes all the way back to Marcel Duchamp and the toilet bowl, and or even maybe putting the mustache on the Mona Lisa. Combining things that might not expect. But I think the question is whether or not combining objects in a place like Cuba has the same significance as it does if a U.S. artist does it in the United States, where we're in a country that's characterized by a lot of consumerism and commodification. And so here, for instance, it says, Robert Rauschenberg was a child of the Great Depression. So he grew up in an era where, it's just like I remember my grandmother growing up, she would never throw out food. And I even remember Hillary Clinton saying this once in her campaign that her generation was very wary of throwing out food because of the Great Depression. It taught you not to be wasteful. So that actually kind of overlaps with the Cuban mindset in the 90s of not being wasteful because the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union today, especially in Cuba, not being wasteful is really, if you want to survive in Cuba, you have to really be careful and frugal with, and resourceful when it comes to art supplies or, making sure your car is still functioning, and things like that. So there's an odd sort of overlap, odd dovetailing between Rauschenberg's style and the realities of living in Cuba starting in the 90s. But that doesn't start until the 90s. In the 80s, it's still very much the heyday of performance art in Cuba. And so likewise for Robert Rauschenberg's kind of versatile artistry, and he's someone who is very versatile. I think you can't separate him from collage, from silkscreen, from found objects, ready-made, and performance. As you can see here, he's skating, I guess roller skating with some big, umbrella on his back. And so he's someone who I think is a really important representative of late 20th century art in terms of performance and physical art. And I think this is, another example of him combining things. That brushstroke, whenever you see a dripping brushstroke, especially in the 1950s into the 1960s, it's both a dripping brushstroke, but it's also either a comment or an acknowledgement of the abstract expressionist movement. And Robert Rauschenberg was someone who I think you could say is both part of that movement, but also a response or rejection of it, because the pendulum swung so far to abstract expressionism that it was almost inevitable that someone like Andy Warhol and then Rauschenberg would push it the other way by bringing pop art or everyday object, consumer goods into art. Because, how can you make art that doesn't somehow appropriate all this pop culture, paper, and imagery we have everywhere. Today, you guys face a different dilemma. In my generation, it was still very much about, paper and folds and touch and all this and collage. And today, now it's digital, right? Digital collage, and you're overwhelmed or inundated with digital imagery. So in a way, when I see Rauschenberg's work in the museum, it feels somewhat like looking at a payphone. And I say that, with some sadness because you can feel almost how it's from an era that's characterized by paper and print material and him kind of gobbling up all this print material, but then eventually reaching a point where he filters it all through silkscreen. And for you guys, the equivalent today would might be, filtering all your that information, the visual information you see every day through some kind of digital way of bringing it to life. And I've seen a lot of you guys are adding kind of elements to your art, your posters, for instance, that gave it a kind of a quality that's like a throwback to this age of print. And I think that's really wonderful for me to see. I don't know if that's just nostalgia, but I think there's a real, when you see the spontaneity, the brushstroke dripping, it's almost like you're bridging the two hemispheres of the brain. There's stuff that's recognizable, that then there's chaos. You got chaos and order simultaneously. And the older I get, the more art I look at, the more I really love seeing art that has, two sides of the hemispheres, both kind of imbalance on the canvas. So expression, self-expression, but also kind of a sense of kind of order or robotic kind of everydayness, mundaneness. Anyway, so I think this artwork kind of tries to bridge those two. But of course, this is the kind of stuff that a lot of people, your typical person, your typical, viewer would say either I don't get it, or my child could do it, or, what's the focal point? And of course, with art like this, I'd say it's abstract art. So we're talking about color, movement, form, for form, color, movement's sake. And that totally makes sense within a certain world, which is the art world in the United States. I think all of you you don't need to have explain the merits of this artwork. You get it just being visually, having, strongly developed visual sense of intuition. But I think it would be crazy to think that the average person would immediately understand it the same way. Maybe a kid would love this. It almost is like a child's like primitive, going back to the primitive idea of postmodernism, the childlike sense of play and experimentation. But that's great. But the adult mind that a lot of us have is very much about, oh, I expect artists to be skilled or make something that I can't do, to justify their existence by making something that is unique and special and requires some kind of skill. And as all of you probably know, the whole point of the modern era of art is to reject that whole mindset of elitism, or at least ostensibly to reject the idea that art needs to be traditional. And I think Rauschenberg is a great spokesperson for that. But then the question is whether or not this sort of modernist or postmodernist sensibility of art for art's sake, pure color. One for minimalism is or postmodernism. One thing that characterizes postmodernism is showing the raw material, making sure there's some place where the raw material is visible as a way of revealing that it's all of the premise of art is illusion and or artifact. And so there's something about postmodernism which is about like not being illusionistic, flattening everything out, letting material speak for itself and not trying to mold it into something that's illusionistic, which is to say like has the illusion of three-dimensionality. So that is really so important for the postmodern art era. And yet I don't think postmodernism fits so well in Cuba. And it's a really interesting dilemma for me because it has somewhat to do with the lack of pop culture, commodification that you have in the United States. So much of capitalism is about either being a celebrity, an influencer, selling stuff, becoming rich. In Cuba, all those things are, somewhat relevant, but not in the same way as the United States. So when Rauschenberg goes to Cuba, and has this confrontation with Glexis Novoa, and or shows basically he'll put a lot of his Rauschenberg's Cuba will open up the institutions of Cuba for Rauschenberg's artwork, and Cubans will flood these institutions and look at Rauschenberg's art and think, I don't get it. Or I don't understand the meaningfulness, significance. Not all, but I think generally Cubans looked at his work and thought, what's this all about? Which is not to say that that was necessarily totally negative. We'll see with Alexis Novoa, but I think it's really important to understand that just like in the United States, a lot of people might look at this work of art and say, I don't get it. That's true in other countries. And it might be true in a different way, especially if you think about Cuba being communist, more about collectivism, more about collective ownership. And so perhaps this is a classic case of a round peg in a square hole, where Rauschenberg's art might make sense to a kind of echo chamber in New York City or in San Francisco or in the art world, but not necessarily, to please people in other parts of the world or outside of that bubble. And so similar to like what you might see if you take my Mexican muralism class, where artists like Diego Rivera have to basically decide, am I going to use Cubism to address the Mexican Revolution, or do I need to kind of make it more populist in its accessibility so that I can visualize the Mexican Revolution in a way that's not, all about cubism and modernism, but really clarity and accessibility. And Robert Rauschenberg, I think, will be much more on the cubist, modernist, abstract kind of approach to art, where it is really still kind of, I think, more exclusive to the art world and all about innovating and experimenting for its own sake. And the more you do that, I think the more you kind of push yourself away from that kind of populist clarity. And so those will be questions I think even an artist like Raul Martinez is addressing here. I think this is very much a tribute, if not um, maybe a critique or even a spoof of Rauschenberg, the style, using that drippy brushstroke style, combining things. I mean, it's hard for me not to look at the mule as a kind of critique of camp. I think is intentionally meant to kind of make fun. It says burro over there on the lower right, which is a donkey. So I think this might possibly, and I can't say for sure, be somewhat of a parody of Robert Rauschenberg's style. Of course, this is 1964, many decades before Rauschenberg's visit in the late 80s. So, if you want to read more about this, I posted a PDF of a critique of Robert Rauschenberg's tour, which, it's easily criticized because it's just one guy who's really rich. Of course, he's rich because he sells his artwork, and he's formed this organization called Rossi. Um, I'll tell you the name yeah, the Rauschenberg oversees cultural interchange, and there's his pet turtle, which is a symbol of it. And again, this is him visiting different countries in the late 80s into the early 90s from it says 1984 till 1991, and going around to different countries and hoping to just, I think, just provoke a reaction or just see what I think maybe the thesis is, what if I go to other countries with my art? That's basically what happens if I do that and make art in other countries. What will that do? What does that mean? And I think it's certainly subject to criticism because you might think, well, it's arrogant, right? It's arrogant of this guy to think that he's so significant that he can just go around the world, especially in a time when when free travel is not available to everyone. The Iron Curtain was a real thing, like people crossing. I don't know if you ever know the movie or the song 99 Balloons, the one in German, like 99, doo, 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 doo. It's a great song about these balloons drifting across the border between East Germany and West Germany, and how World War III almost begins because someone accidentally releases these balloons that just drift across the no man's land, and people see the balloons and they think, okay, someone's launching their weapons at us. And they go into high alert, and the song is a parody of just the paranoia in the 1990 in the Cold War era, with the two sides of Germany being split and that Iron Curtain separating one side from the other. So Robert Rauschenberg is, the turtle is meant to kind of perforate that Iron Curtain. And I think it does to a degree, but I think the curtain was already, rusting and full of holes. And so, it's not him that kind of tore down the curtain, but he's kind of I think a part of this wave of change that takes place in the late 80s and into the 1990s. So in addition to, like I said, Cuba, he visits China and other countries. And I think the reception is different depending on the country. I think probably in China, just like in any country, they kind of uh, met Robert Rauschenberg artwork with a mix of, you know, intrigue, but also like, kind of shrugging their shoulders because I mean, what would you expect from someone visiting your country? What can they really, what kind of mirror can they hold up to you if they don't speak the language, if they don't stay in the country for much longer than a few weeks? And that is a very classic dilemma that faces anyone who travels. When I was in Guatemala for a few years in the Peace Corps, I met a lot of travelers who kind of wish they could take deeper roots and stay in one place much longer. And then, of course, the people who do take those deep roots or plant those deep roots sometimes wish they could cut the roots and travel to more places and stay more like a tourist. And of course, each has a trade-off. And in the case of Rauschenberg, I think he's doing his best to find imagery that he thinks is, beautiful, interesting, but also somehow holds up a mirror to the host country. And I think that's kind of the nature of his visit, to just sort of be like a fish out of water. And, I don't think there's a political agenda so much as like using art to overcome these insurmountable differences, right? Or using art to bridge people and bring them together. But I think you can see that while his artwork is very accessible because it's maybe everyday objects, I think there's nothing politically incendiary about it, but there's also nothing politically kind of clear about it either. So I think the audience here, I think, is kind of like looking at his artwork the same way a lot of people look at artwork by any minimalist artist or modern postmodern artist today, where they just don't know whether they should walk around it, if they're allowed to step on top of it, or just kind of take a selfie with it. Um, and so I think that's kind of partly what's going on here. And you can see it says suspicious local officials feared the Americans would steal their paper-making secret. So, I think that captures a sense of maybe distrust or paranoia that exists between, even today, I think between China and the United States, there's a little bit of, to put it lightly, a little bit of tension between about economics and stuff like that. So it's even in this era in the Cold War, there was that distrust. So you could say, to his credit, Rauschenberg, what he's doing here is trying to mitigate that distrust and offer some kind of bridge so that we can find some kind of common ground and diminish the mistrust. And of course, whether or not that's true in Cuba will be up for us to see. So here you can see some more examples of his artwork. Not all of it is silkscreen. Here it looks like he's actually taking the original artwork, or maybe silk screening it, but not transforming it too much. And it's really like it's a matter for you to decide whether or not you can achieve any real change with just sort of or any kind of meaningful visual connection by basically kind of regurgitating local imagery for back at locals to see. And I think there could, Rauschenberg clearly has a wonderful visual intuition when it comes to color and imagery. But at the same time, it's almost like he's the end of an era that is today. That I think we're digital, and I wonder whether or not Rauschenberg's artwork is translatable to this new era. Um, Anyway, just something to think about. So you could see I think to his credit, he paid this for everything. He mortgaged his home. He was a Captiva resident here in Florida. Um, and his artwork is very collectible. So his work fetches a lot of money at auction houses. And I love his silkscreen. It's really, I absolutely adore, primary colors, and there's something about silkscreen that combines the expressiveness of paint and abstraction with the authority of photography and imagery. And, for me, that's why I think I love artwork that has a little bit of the left brain and the right brain. That, for me, is how I kind of see this. It has kind of a little bit of photography, expressiveness, but then, of course, it's another question of whether or not it comes together with some meaningfulness beyond just sort of visual poetry, if you will. And I think that really depends on the piece, maybe depends on the country, and depends on how he's able to find maybe imagery that becomes like a symbol or distillation of the character of a nation, right? So I think when it comes to Cuba, he'll discover that the little star, becomes almost a perfect symbol for Cuba, especially because it kind of resembles the turtle that he has, which is just kind of an amusing little side note. So, these were made in Chile. And when you look at this, you might wonder, well, is there anything recognizably Chilean? Does there need to be anything recognizably Chilean? And more importantly, if you're a Chilean, someone from Chile, and you look at this, will you say like, oh wow, this artist has really revealed something, that I've overlooked about my national character, or something like that? Or if you're an artist, are you going to say, wow, this artist is really, offering some kind of revelation about the nature of art, and or what art says about society or politics. And I think it really depends on the country. And I think in Cuba particularly, because Cuba is so isolated from the rest of the world because of the embargo, the blockade, I think he'll actually, I think, make a lot of waves, unexpected waves. And I think you'll see that when it comes to Glexus Novoa. So now we're in Mexico. I think you can appreciate he's trying to do something different with each country. Here, there's a little more kind of newspaper print, some abstract expressionism, this border that has some kind of Mexican pop culture or commodity. I don't know what it is. To his credit, he's avoiding, cliches, or at least I think trying to avoid cliches, of course. But then, of course, having the flag, the Mexican flag in the middle, you could say that veers towards cliche. But I think he's sophisticated enough where he knows the difference between like kind of low hanging fruit and the poetry, visual poetry. And to his credit, he has such a deep sense of connection to his visual intuition that even when it can be is even if it's shallow and somewhat veers into cliche, it's still pretty visually dazzling. Maybe not this one so much as other examples, but I think he's trying. He's doing his best. He's trying to come up with something. Remember, he doesn't speak Spanish, so it's not like he's getting these deep connections to the locals. So it's, like I said, a tourist view, but a tourist who's an artist and creating objects that are a response to what he sees while he's in his country. So one critique in the PDF I mentioned is a slightly naive but well-intentioned approach to activism. And yeah, I think that's a fair way of characterizing his visit. It's a kind of art activism, and what does it mean to be an activist artist? And that is where he really dovetails with the performance art scene in the 1980s, um, almost from two perspectives. With Glexus Novoa treating performance from the grassroots level, and then Robert Rauschenberg using this sort of visual performance of collecting imagery from the kind of ivory tower as someone who can travel freely around the world with a big pocketbook to draw from. And now here we are in 1989 in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union already is beginning to, I think, hemorrhage when it comes to, or at least buckle under the changes going on, internal changes with glasnost and perestroika under Gorbachev. But yeah, here I think he does kind of capture, something, there's a Mexican vibrancy here. Taking the bus is definitely it's bus is a form of like public transportation. You see that throughout Guatemala. Here, he's almost capturing a kind of Soviet quality that's somewhat less vibrant, perhaps. And, I think he is somewhat, clearly processing the country, the host country, and paying tribute to him visually. I think with by really understanding the difference between the character, uniqueness of the character of each country. And then here is his work he's made in the 1960s in the United States. So he's not, too, you could see how this style has been deployed for this work he's making. And I think it's a little more relatable, this kind of work, because there's some grounding in something recognizable versus this. The chair is the most recognizable thing here. So the chair, kind of leaps out of that canvas, and you're supposed to make a connection between one and the other. But it's kind of visual poetry as far as I see it, kind of balancing out form, texture, color, space, and maybe reconciling all that with this everyday object, which is both a chair, but now it's not a chair, it's part of a painting. And likewise here, this is the heyday of his career in the late 50s, and where I think he really found his stride, finding everyday object, combining them, and forcing you to kind of figure out that kind of maybe reinvent your definition of art. But I think it's really interesting for me when you think about Cuba, because something like this, this is a really effective strategy in Cuba to avoid trouble, because remember, with Antonia Itis, the state has a monopoly on photography and maybe even imagery. And so if you're making artwork that has one foot in representation and one foot in experimentation, this is a very effective strategy of avoiding trouble, because you're still being expressive, but maybe not overstepping, the state's monopoly on imagery. And everyday objects have a certain kind of offer a kind of shield behind which you can make art. And the everydayness of the object makes it kind of like, it makes it kind of less subject to criticism, perhaps. But I think it's you see stuff like this in Cuba, but for different reasons, right? Because it's a way of avoiding trouble perhaps and avoiding scrutiny from the state, whereas Rauschenberg's making this artwork as a way of reinventing art and maybe pushing the boundaries of what we consider art. And it's just a really odd kind of meeting of the style, which is effective in Cuba for one reason, effective in from Rauschenberg's point of view for another reason, and yet when they kind of meet in Cuba, I think that's where you kind of get sparks and a little bit of like a, having like a European power outlet with an American kind of plug, and you kind of have to figure out how you're going to charge your phone. So, this is something he makes in Cuba. So now we get to Cuba, and I do think the Cuba examples are some of the best of the ones we see. I think it has somewhat to do with Cuba, um, and also because he's already tried, worked for a few years on this journey and this investigation. And I think Cuba is later on the journey, so he's already formulated his style enough where the Cuba trip benefits from him, that formulation from refining. And I think he's the clarity here is because of that time visiting other countries. So yeah, it's good that maybe he saved Cuba for last, best for last, because the artwork he makes is, I think, the best of the places. But still, I think subject to scrutiny because it is still kind of an outsider's view, number one, and maybe a shallow view. Um, so you see things like sugarcane on the lower right, donkeys. You see like agriculture. So he's going out in the countryside, but he's also combining that with some moments from Havana, or buildings. But there aren't really any recognized. There aren't too many examples of Cubans, right? The very middle here, for instance, just pure yellow, and you might consider the significance of color, but also that star, like I said, will become a really wonderful kind of, I think, common denominator in a lot of the artwork from Cuba. And like I said, the Havana or the government of Cuba will open up their institutions to exhibit all of these works that Robert Rauschenberg makes, silk screens, and that's a chance for him to not just make, take photographs, but then take photographs, transform them into imagery, and then put those on exhibit. And I'm sure he also exhibited other examples from work he made in these other countries, but he put them on display at these big institutions in Havana, like the National Museum, the Casa de las Americas, the Castillo de la Fuerza, which is the same monument where we saw the rusted podiums, the rusted microphones earlier. So these are major institutions, and the fact that the Cuban government opened up their doors to this artist, you could say is a sign that Cuba has some kind of interest in building bridges or solidarity with using this American artist. But I think the reality is, I think they were trying to mock. I think they wanted to use this as an opportunity to kind of make fun of Robert Rauschenberg, because I think the Cuban government thought his work is a little bit kind of ivory tower, a little bit out of touch. And it could be that, or it could be the first case, or a blend of both, but something for sure for you to consider, because I think a lot of Cuban artists have a hard time really engaging with his work, for reasons we'll get into in a moment. So, for instance, it says Rauschenberg's critics at the time accused the artist of cultural aggrandizement. Aggrandizement is like, vanity, like inflating your own sense of self-importance. A neo-Dada turned neo-imperialist. So taking that Dada form, that kind of lampooning, satirical quality of the art world that starts with Duchamp, and after World War I, ready-made, and kind of incorporating satire into art, and saying that he's basically this Dada artist who's become an imperialist. His appropriation of local cultures is no less problematic today, but others recognized the U.S. artist's generosity and the spirit of altruism of the project. So up to you guys to kind of decide one way or the other. I do think his artwork is always generally beautiful and poetic. And here he is sweating to death in Cuba, as many of you will if you ever go to Cuba, especially in the summer, which, probably starting now all the way into August. It's quite hot. And, I think he's going around doing his best to engage with people, but that camera is really the key tool of engagement, because he doesn't have Spanish, or I don't think he's even going around with an interpreter. Well, he does, I think during the conferences he'll give, but I think you can see that his whole approach here is using camera, the photograph, and um, now that I say that, I realize, that as we said, that the state has a monopoly on photography, and yet, the photography Rauschenberg's taking aren't there's no pictures of Che Guevara, right? There's no like heroic. It's not these aren't heroic pictures. These are mundane pictures. These are everyday pictures, texture, form, color, kind of little micro motifs or micro icons, all filtered through this uniformity of color, which I think is one of the more powerful things to make everything uniform with color. And yet, you've got to wonder. I think when Cuban artists visit this, they might be thinking, well, what's the message? Is there some kind of veiled critique? Or is this the Cold War? Is he solving the Cold War single-handedly with these pictures? What's the point? And I think that is exactly what Glexis Novoa will wonder about when he visits these institutions and sees Rauschenberg's artwork. And not just his artwork, but Rauschenberg will also create a bunch of posters, and that should kind of alert you because we've looked at posters. So Rauschenberg makes these posters to announce these conferences that he gives at several of these institutions in response to the kind of lukewarm reception he receives from his artwork because Cubans are a little like, I don't get it. And so, in response to that, he actually holds these conferences where he tries to explain his artwork. And I went and watched the video of these conferences that he gave, and that would become the subject of my master's paper. So I'll get back to that in a moment. So I guess here is an example where we do see Che Guevara, maybe not quite the heroic Che Guevara. This feels more like a kind of mundane. I don't think Che Guevara is given much of a kind of heroic quality here. So just the fact that he's taking Che Guevara and maybe reducing him to just sort of noise here, it could, that definitely be seen as somewhat political and or subversive and or pushing buttons. Um, but that's maybe something we'll consider. And imagery here on the left, this could be, has some political power. Of course, sugarcane is very powerful, and you might consider if there's any kind of if you're supposed to see this as some kind of formula, visual formula, x plus y equals z kind of thing, or a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And I do think there are times you could possibly read into some kind of deep political message using hiding behind the shield of everyday objects, and that's something to consider. But I don't think Rauschenberg ever got that deep into politics. I think he's someone who would say politics is kind of downstream from art, and or kind of a very shallow one-dimensional realm, and he's much more interested in kind of deep visual, kind of something transcendent or something way deeper than the kind of than the political than politics. Um, so yeah, here's another example from Cuba. There's so much that space. He's letting so much space breathe here. And notice his big sprawling name. I think his name is something that does kind of contribute to that kind of criticism of him being so aggrandized because his name sometimes his signature takes up a lot of the canvas. But you notice that little star, we see that again here, and the star with Che Guevara. So you do see there is some an emerging motif. That little star becomes almost a focal point in these paintings. And the people standing on the edge with a boat is definitely a foreshadowing or an homage to this idea of traveling Cuba, leaving Cuba. Um, and here are just a few more examples from the work he made in Cuba. And here is a poster. So these posters will advertise Rauschenberg's conferences that he gives to kind of explain his visit, to explain his artwork to people. And this says here, countering criticism that his paintings did not celebrate the complete history of Cuba. Rauschenberg, during an open forum for students and the public, maintained, to break down barriers, I think you need to basically see as an alien does, to get lost in a city or in that country, to see things in Cuba that maybe you're blind to. So, he's saying, I'm a fish out of water. I'm like an Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm visiting your country and offering all the fresh clarity of an outsider visiting you, seeing things that maybe you might not see because you're kind of immersed in this environment. And there's certainly some truth to that, but I think it really depends on how on the mirror you hold up to your society. And so here, this poster, I think, captures, almost as flows right out of the pictures we've already seen. As he's using a star instead of the letter A. Now, when he writes the letter A, it's like a star shape. And of course, you got Che Guevara there in the middle. Um, so these posters are, paper, and paper is a rare, it's not easy to get paper in Cuba in the late 80s. There's still scarcity. And so Glexis Novoa will see these posters and collect the posters because it's like, hey, this is paper. I can reuse this. I can use this to make art. And so remember that Glexis Novoa will take one of these posters down and he'll bring it with him to one of Rauschenberg's conferences and stage this performance piece with his group of other artists, called Grupo Provisional, if I remember correctly. And so he'll use one of these posters, in the performance piece, as we'll see. In fact, it's one of these posters that he uses. So, this poster will be part of the performance art, by Glexis Novoa that we'll see in a moment. And the performance takes place at the Castillo de la Fuerza. This is the fortress at the mouth of Havana Harbor, a colonial fortress built by the Spanish, and very recognizable monument in Havana, and still very much shows the kind of colonial era of Havana. And here is Glexis Novoa there in the plaid pants, standing in front, and you could see Robert Rauschenberg there holding a paintbrush. So basically, what happens is Glexis Novoa interrupts this conference that Robert Rauschenberg is giving in the Castillo de la Fuerza in Havana, and he interrupts it with his other, I guess, teammates, his other associates, the other artists who are part of his performance art group. And you notice there's kind of two things going on here. There's Glexis Novoa up front, he gives Robert Rauschenberg a paintbrush, and he says, "Here, will you sign this poster?" And of course, the poster that he signs is Rauschenberg's own poster, this one right here. But in the background, you see these two guys are holding up this giant square cardboard object. And so there's kind of these two things going on. There's this interchange between Rauschenberg and Glexis Novoa, but there's also this kind of iron curtain, this shield, this wall that's kind of hiding everything from view. And because of that, a lot of commentary about this interaction was incorrect. A lot of pretty much all of the writers who've written about this, and I read a lot of their writing, uh, says, "Oh, Robert Rauschenberg signed this giant square placard that you see in the back." But in fact, as you can see from this video still, Robert Rauschenberg is not signing that big square cardboard piece in the back. So I know this because you can see here from the video clip, but I had to go to the Rauschenberg Foundation in New York City to look at the video. And when I watched the video, it's quite clear, oh, he's not signing that cardboard square, kind of big object there in the back. He's signing something else. So I kept watching the video, and sure enough, it turned out Glexis Novoa, had brought Robert Rauschenberg's poster and had him sign the poster, which is a very different kind of exchange and a very different, kind of story than the one that, most of the art historians, I mean, actually all of them, basically got wrong, because they're all repeating the same, inaccurate story, which is Robert Rauschenberg signed this giant poster, this giant square cardboard. And the reason why, well, I think, fascinating questions like, why did they get this wrong? And I think one of the reasons they got it wrong is because even Glexis Novoa continues, I think even today, I haven't looked recently, but if you look on his website, in his sort of biography, he repeats what the art historians say, which is Robert Rauschenberg signed this giant cardboard piece. And I think it's very interesting that even Glexis Novoa parroted the same false narrative, and you have to wonder why, and leave that question as we move forward. So he's a major part of the performance art piece, and we'll get back to that encounter with Rauschenberg in a moment by way of looking at Glexis Novoa's own artwork. So here is an example of his artwork in 1987, and this is a few years, or 1 or 2 years before, or I think 1 year prior to Robert Rauschenberg's visit. And I love this. It looks like something from the 1980s, something like Keith Haring or maybe a Basquiat, but with this kind of Cuban flavor. You've got the boombox, as it was called. It used to be called the ghetto blaster. I think the word ghetto has probably fallen out of favor, but that was definitely the term that people used. Walking around with your boombox, was like you were the cool guy. You were the cool person, having your Nikes and your kind of 80s style. So this feels like it's almost like kind of capturing that 1980s sense of pop culture, consumer goods. Even the writing shows a kind of international focus. And I love, Alexis Novoa's style. It's very accessible, maybe not super skilled, but I think you guys are probably sophisticated enough to know that you don't have to have a lot of skill for your artwork to have another kind of clarity or primitive appeal. And I think that's really what's going on here. But he's someone who's more famous for, well, both famous for his art objects, and which will end up combining architecture and other kind of forms of authority, but also his performance art, which brings us back to that piece that we saw with Fidel Castro earlier, where he's revisiting, walking down memory lane, so to speak, from this era in the 1980s, this very vibrant time of performance. And I think it goes back to, performance art works really well in a society that's all about collectivism and communalism. And so there's a kind of, I think, subversive quality to performance art in Cuba, because they're saying, look, all we're doing is making art in a communal way. So you can't criticize us because this is very much in the same spirit. This is within the revolution, right? So of course the problem with performance art is it doesn't necessarily, like we saw with Ana Mendieta, how do you translate your performance into something other than a photograph of the performance? And I think these pictures capture the spirit of the 80s, like breakdancing. Breakdancing was such a big deal in the 1980s. If you want to really have a lot of fun, you could look on YouTube and watch Mr. Rogers, that show from Sesame Street or from what PBS back in the 80s. And he has a breakdancer visit, and the breakdancer teaches Mr. Rogers how to breakdance. And that was a big part of the 1980s. So dance, that guy looks like he's dressed up as Michael Jackson. I'd say definitely, peak Michael Jackson, the bad era. And Michael Jackson, I can't, I've learned a little bit more about Michael Jackson in the last year to definitely alter my appraisal of Michael Jackson. But up until then, and especially in the 1980s, if you were a little kid growing up in the 1980s, it was like Michael Jackson, uh, Luke Skywalker, Michael Jordan, Mike Tyson. Those were every kid just worshipped them for, and Michael Jackson, a very interesting figure, because when you were growing up in the 1980s, it was sort of this era where you've kind of, at least culturally, moving beyond super race and superficial differences, and Michael Jackson was a beautiful bridge that blurred boundaries and was a really transcendent kind of figure. Of course, I've learned things about him that do detract from that image that he has. I think there's a reason why you haven't seen a movie about Michael Jackson. You probably won't, because it sounds like he was doing some pretty horrible things in the background. But that aside, the sort of public image of Michael Jackson was one of like dance and a popular appeal. And I think they're really, he became an international sensation. And in Cuba, to celebrate Michael Jackson is more than just, oh, we like Michael Jackson. It's, like we saw with the last week, All You Need Is Love is a Beatles song. So or Volumen Uno is the name of a Led Zeppelin song, right? So to celebrate American pop culture is more than just that. In Cuba, it's, definitely pushing the boundaries, because you're sort of you're basically putting at the top of the hierarchy, the imperialist United States, and that's definitely pushing some buttons. But of course, if it's just a performance, if it's just a dance piece, then once it's over, no more problems. There's who are you going to arrest? It's over. So I think that's the power of performance, that it has a time span, and it's sort of like someone doing graffiti. Once the graffiti's finished, they disappear into the night. Who are you going to arrest? You could paint over the wall, but the person is gone. And so there's a real value to taking your art to the street, doing performance, especially in a time of paranoia or state supervision, and of course having all these people. Who are you going to arrest? Just like with protests, like who, the strength in numbers, safety in numbers. Who are you going to arrest? The herd, if you will, right? So these pictures, I think, really capture the idea that more people come to your performance, the more of a kind of collective engagement there is, the less trouble you're going to get, and the more powerful tool of performance it becomes. And so, really, here's Alexis Novoa. It says, in 1986, Castro had announced a plan to rectify Cuban socialism, and some artists saw this as an invitation to act as the critical conscience of society. Havana's art scene in the late 1980s was the country's most dynamic cultural front. So it sounds like Fidel Castro maybe gave some speech and gave some sense that there was some tacit approval or acceptance of performance as a or opening of cultural thawing, allowing for more, allowing the artists so they could kind of take more liberty. I think that's exactly what Glexis Novoa and others do, and it does reach a kind of boiling point in the early '90s, and then boils over. And I think artists kind of by that point realize they've that era is kind of coming to an end. And Glexis Novoa was certainly at the tip of the spear. And his group that he forms, El Grupo Provisional, you can read more about it in the book that you have. We don't have time to go into every one of his performances, but they're all very much in that kind of, in the vein of bringing their performance to some kind of official event, and and there's never an overt attempt to challenge necessarily Fidel Castro like the way he does in Miami in that performance we saw earlier, Honorary Guest. It's more like his kind of like Dada or performance clowning, if you will, like pranking, maybe pranking like you would see in like YouTube videos, right? So you're not necessarily, being political so much as maybe being provocative and and getting some kind of notoriety because you're maybe boldly challenging, public events or making a statement at public event, but being very careful not to do so in a way that's anything but still supportive of the state. So, for instance, him coming to the Rauschenberg conference at the Castillo de la Fuerza and doing this performance, the value there or the way the way he avoids trouble is basically by making it seem like he's making fun of Robert Rauschenberg rather than making fun of the Cuban government. But I think the reality is, if you watch the video like I did, it seemed like he's making fun of Rauschenberg, but in the end, he's kind of doing something, I think, a really powerful, doing a very powerful performance that is subverting the state. And I think, I'll make that argument in a moment. And that's why for me it's so interesting that Glexis Novoa keeps kind of parrots the same narrative about the performance, even though I mean he was directly involved in it. I mean he was there, he was in the performance. It's funny to me that he on his website he says something different than actually what took place. So we'll get back to that in just a moment. So it says here the real reason, the urgency and need for free expression. Um, Performance became the ideal tool for communicating ideas. So I think you still can, you can't necessarily trade this directly back to Antonia Itis and what happened to her with her provocative painting with the podium and her getting sort of forcibly early retired. But I don't think I think you have to kind of consider how that has a ripple effect on other artists, and they seek ways of making art and expressing themselves that don't necessarily lead to trouble, right? And so I think performance is one way, like I've said, to perhaps express yourself and benefit from that kind of herd, the strength in numbers, the safety of the communal approach to art. So the video I watched of Rauschenberg's encounter with Rauschenberg really offers, and this is the subject of my master's paper, which is linked on your syllabus, so you can read it if you want. It's always really hard to read something you wrote 10, 20 years ago because you want to edit it and you just kind of you change as a writer. So, my eyes roll a little bit when I read some of my old writing, but nevertheless, I think there's some nice substance there because it's really all about watching the video and realizing there's a whole different story about what happened that took place that's different than what most art historians write. And I mean, these are all the major writers, art historians about Cuba. Many of them address this Robert Rauschenberg visit, but they write about it by repeating the same story, which is Rauschenberg signed this giant placard, which is not the case. So we'll get back to that in a moment. So this picture from the performance is actually audiences at Rauschenberg's performance. I think it captures the kind of boredom, if not kind of dismay or kind of uncertainty, or maybe not uncertainty, but just boredom about Rauschenberg's explanation. So and if you watch the video, it is classic kind of listening to an artist who's probably better off not speaking because the art speaks for itself. Because if you listen to Robert Rauschenberg's explanation to this room full of Cubans who are, I think, arrived eager to hear something powerful, and then get there, and basically Robert Rauschenberg spends the whole conference talking about his pet turtle and all this stuff, which is kind of fun and interesting, but doesn't really do anything except just kind of preserve that kind of sense of uh, round peg in a square hole. Like the Cubans just don't get it. And I think it's just, again, because Robert Rauschenberg is kind of an outsider, looking at Cuba from a kind of tourist perspective. And and yet, nevertheless, this conference that he has is an opportunity for Glexis Novoa to have this performance piece. So to Rauschenberg's credit, from the perspective of someone like Glexis Novoa, this says that this is actually from, I believe, from for a comment about Glexis Novoa, his reaction to Rauschenberg, and it says the texture of Rauschenberg's paintings, as well as Rauschenberg's incorporation of everyday objects in his artwork, greatly impressed Novoa. Like most Cuban artists, he had only been exposed to foreign art through the flattening language of magazines, newspapers, books, and television. Most of the pop artists had a very flat language. That's all about postmodern flattening art, no illusion. So this integration of big life-size objects, suggesting the use of these objects often of industrial design, that make a link between the use and the object. So that was very, like I said, that is a bridge between the Cuban sensibility and the American sensibility, U.S. sensibility of everyday objects, combining them together and kind of creating some kind of meaning out of them. But also in the case of Cuba, the everydayness of the object becomes a shield behind which you can kind of express yourself without trouble, without getting into trouble. But at the other side, at the other extreme, Glexis Novoa, who was at 23 at the time, was struck by the presence of an army of art handlers. So wherever Rauschenberg went, he had this army of assistants helping him mount his work. And in addition to that kind of maybe almost army-like kind of presence with, reinforces that sense of having an imperialist aura. He also noticed that, Rauschenberg was like defacing these locations by mounting his artwork. Um, so he says, far from celebrating Cuban history, Rauschenberg was defacing it. So I think Glexis Novoa came to this event being somewhat critical of Rauschenberg, and wanting to kind of lampoon him. And again, that's a way of, lampooning Rauschenberg plays right into the Cuban government's whole agenda here, which is to kind of, to criticize Rauschenberg, not to criticize the government. Yeah, the sickly geriatric character. Sorry, Jossie, I'm just reading your comment about Fidel Castro, and that's right on. I think that's the whole point, to treat Fidel Castro like he's sickly, geriatric, out of touch, kind of a ghost from another era where he's obsolete. We'll get back to that in a moment. But in terms of Rauschenberg, the macho man-sized proportions struck a dissonant chord. So, and this kind of goes back to the abstract expressionist movement, the heroic scale of abstract art, making abstract art at a huge billboard-like scale is so out of touch with that Cuban approach. Because remember, this goes back to us talking about the whole nature of political art and poster art and clarity and the rejection of abstraction early on, because it's so personalized, it's so expressive, it's so outside the revolution. So for Robert Rauschenberg to bring these monumental, heroic, billboard-sized, cinematic-sized works of silkscreen that are basically kind of maybe abstract and or maybe metaphorical, but still kind of abstract. It really goes to show that he's kind of going the totally opposite direction than what we've seen, the kind of the trend in Cuban art, which is away from abstraction, away from anything too personal and expressive, and really all about the monopoly of the photography. Now, of course, in this case, he does have photography, so in that sense, maybe he is overlapping with the Cuban government. But I think you can appreciate that. Glexis Novoa, I think, looked at this and said, okay, it's so big. The huge scale suggests self-importance, suggests like self-evident authority and worth, and yet the scale is one thing, but the content, the subject matter seems to maybe detract from that self-evident worth and authority that you get from the scale. And I think that is Alexis Novoa's, one criticism that he has, and yet will go on to, I think, have a influence on Alexis Novoa's own work, because, well, we'll see afterwards. I think Robert Rauschenberg will end up brushing off on Alexis Novoa in a positive way, even as Alexis Novoa has Rauschenberg, literally take a brush and sign his name onto the poster, and that is in fact what happened. So As you can see here, it says, print editions of the posters didn't remain in public view for very long because artists like Alexis Novoa basically took the poster because paper was a precious commodity. And to his credit, he rolled up the poster, brought it with him to this performance. And this is the giant poster, not the little one I just showed you, but the giant cardboard square postcard, if you will, or poster or painting that they bring into the performance. So during Rauschenberg conference, while people are bored to death, as you can see here, suddenly there's this commotion, and out comes this giant poster, almost like ants carrying a giant leaf. This boring moment is interrupted by this excitement where the Grupo Provisional brings out this poster, and it's very much intended to be a Taino Indian, like a Taino Native American. And it says Grupo Provisional on the lower right. That's the name of the group. So they're signing their name to the performance. And out of the mouth of the Native American, it says, "Very good, Rauschenberg." And so obviously it's made for the performance for Rauschenberg conference. And they march up to Robert Rauschenberg, as we saw earlier, and bring this giant postcard, this giant, what we call it, almost billboard-sized object, and they stand right in front of Robert Rauschenberg. So it's not, it's understandable why people who were there witnessing this event might have gotten the details wrong. Because instead of kind of seeing what really took place, which is Alexis Novoa hands Robert Rauschenberg a paintbrush with paint and says, "Here, in somewhat broken English, will you sign this, please?" And as you can see, Robert Rauschenberg accommodates him and takes the brush and signs his name onto the poster. But I think it's quite obvious, and there's no question that Robert Rauschenberg did not sign his name on this giant piece of art. And if you read any commentary from all the art historians, they all say, "Oh, Robert Rauschenberg signed his name onto this," which is totally different than him signing his own poster. So what I think is so wonderful about this moment here is they almost use this giant postcard, this giant thing in the back, this billboard, to hide what actually takes place. I don't know if that was by design. I like to think it was, because it's almost like they're kind of playing around with the idea of, within the revolution, outside the revolution. Well, by just adding this curtain, you're almost like creating a safe space where you can act outside the revolution. And I think for me, which is what my paper is about, that's the whole beauty of this moment, that they staged this performance playing with all these variables, with, the state wanting to make fun of Rauschenberg, the Grupo Provisional having their own performance idea, the audience having this sort of collective boredom and uncertainty about Robert Rauschenberg's whole, existence. And then amidst all that, there is this kind of act of subterfuge, this sort of clandestine thing that takes place right in front of everyone's eyes, and yet everyone gets it wrong because they concealed it from view. It's like this thing that takes place in front of everyone, and yet no one can really see it because it's hidden from view by most. And most writers who've written about this are repeating the same kind of false testimony about it, but it's only false because they were very clever about concealing what really took place from view. Now, whether or not that was by design is very interesting for me, because it goes back to Alexis Novoa. When you read his website on his artist statement, I interviewed him about this, and he never really gave me a good answer, and he hasn't changed his story. He basically said he repeats the same false testimony, which is, Robert Rauschenberg signed this, but you can see very clearly he's not signing that. And if there's any doubt, here it is from the other perspective. And here's Rauschenberg putting his, brush onto that poster, which you can see on the right. So he's signing his name, and there's the poster. So, the video doesn't lie. If, on another angle, here you go. So it says Rauschenberg writes his sprawling. So this is actually from my own paper. So this is me commenting on the video. But if you read any other art historians writing about this, they'll say, "No, no, Rauschenberg's actually signing, the other poster, this thing on the back, on the right." And that would be that's a very different thing. Because if he gets Rauschenberg to sign this, then it's like, it's kind of a lampooning Rauschenberg, because already lampooning Rauschenberg. So for Rauschenberg to sign this is like another layer of kind of just clowning the artist. But in fact, they use that to hide the real moment that takes place, which is basically Alexis Novoa got Robert Rauschenberg's autograph. and he autographed his own poster. And I sure hope Glexus Novoa saved that poster because it will be very valuable one day. And so if you watch the video, not only do you see the real story that takes place, you can hear it. And when Robert Rauschenberg's handed the poster and the paintbrush, Rauschenberg says, "Why this?" Asking Glexus Novoa. And Glexus Novoa says, "It will look better this way." Basically, I guess saying his poster will look better if you sign your name on the poster. But you could also see this as like, oh, it'll be more valuable this way. So sure enough, he signs his name. Um, Rauschenberg writes his sprawling signature across the poster. These are my words, from the left to the edge to the right. And then he doesn't lift up the brush at the end. You can see on the video, he actually marks Glexus Novoa's pants. So at the very end of writing the G at the end of Rauschenberg, he lets the brush slip off the poster and marks Glexus Novoa's pants. And that's very much deliberate and very much like him being kind of a mischievous, but also I think it's a way of tit for tat, getting right back at Glexus Novoa, who is very, congenial about it, and I think appreciates the moment of getting back at Glexus Novoa. So there's this really wonderful kind of human exchange between these two artists that almost kind of takes place like outside of time and space because they've got this kind of poster, which you can see is hiding from view all of what's taking place. And then, as no sooner than he marks Glexus Novoa's pants, he gives him the brush back, and Glexus Novoa and the others retreat, and the moment is over. So for me, it's just this moment of being outside the revolution, kind of basically getting away from all the politics, using art to kind of create this momentary safe space where Glexus Novoa has this meaningful exchange between artists, where it's almost like a tribute, homage to each other. And both get to act in a way. So remember, this is all in the context of Rauschenberg trying to give this conference where he's trying to connect to other artists and failing, in the most kind of the most epic way possible. And then suddenly there's this Grupo Provisional that comes in, creates this sort of curtain, and within that kind of safe space, they do have a meaningful reaction. So he Rauschenberg conference is a failure, but for this momentary interaction between Glexus and Novoa and Rauschenberg, which does achieve this kind of bridge between these two artists, which, the language barrier is gone, the politics are gone, the kind of, and, this moment between Glexus Novoa and Robert Rauschenberg is really significant when you reflect back on the initial exhibit we saw with Glexus Novoa, now in Miami, now with someone pretending to be Fidel Castro, and that Fidel Castro's character says, "Oh yeah, I was up till 3 a.m. talking to Robert Rauschenberg." And now that you see this, you realize, oh wait, but hold on. Glexus Novoa had his own interaction with Robert Rauschenberg that Fidel Castro will never know about, because he's just in his ivory tower, in his political bubble. But now we get to see this sort of really neat interaction between these artists. Now, it's not like they changed the world or single-handedly ended the Cold War, but they did achieve this moment of being outside the revolution and did so through art and performance. And I just think the whole thing is just lovely on every level. But the real twist on it is like Glexus Novoa, he still repeats, and maybe I need to go back to his website and see, but it's like video doesn't lie. But more importantly, here is Glexus Novoa literally getting the paintbrush back, getting the poster back. So you got to wonder why Glexus Novoa continues to say on his website that, Rauschenberg signed the very good Rauschenberg behind him rather than the poster. And I think it just goes into maybe just, might feel obligated to repeat the narrative that other art historians say because maybe that makes you look better. Maybe that's the sort of that narrative, lifts you up and elevates you into this level of being, maybe you've lampooned Rauschenberg, and that's the sort of value of preserving that narrative. But I think we all, as people who kind of, hopefully appreciate the truth more, and especially because here in this case, the truth is much more interesting than the false narrative, because I just think it's so neat that Glexus Novoa used this opportunity to achieve something which is so rare in Cuba, which is to go outside the revolution. So it's, just an interesting question. I think perhaps because Glexus Novoa is basically in exile from Cuba, maybe preserving that false testimony and just, making that the truth, maybe that just kind of keeps his own kind of bona fides, his own sort of valor, his worthiness as a Cuban artist keeps it kind of shiny and impeccable. And yet I hope one day he's able to see that the truth is much more interesting than the politics. Because for me, the real, I guess, black eye in the story to have the false testimony or the incorrect story is because it kind of takes away from the real beauty of this performance, and the achievement here, that Glexis Novoa accomplishes. So yeah, and in a way, it's kind of, if you do the false testimony idea that Rauschenberg is, signing the very good poster in the back, this one, it kind of plays into that whole, like, one dimensionality of the revolution, within or without, either or. But this is like gray area. This is like blurring the two. This is really something other, something else. And so maybe one day Glexis Novoa will embrace the truth. But even after I interviewed him, I didn't really get a good response from him. For and it's very hard to talk to someone and say, hey, why, basically, like, why aren't you telling the truth about your own art career? So it's just, that was the subject of my master's paper. And I think there's all kinds of moments in Cuba where, either you're within the revolution or not, but there's all that, but to look for places where it's neither, or it's neither, you're kind of in that space in between, will be, is a fascinating thing to consider, especially when you write about your final paper. So before we take a break, I just want to comment briefly on, oh, and I guess going a lot further than I expected, so we might not even
Morning.
get through everything today. But
Yeah,
just
good. How are you?
this is a final comment here. I think someone's microphone's on, not that it matters. But so final comment. Remember, he had been very critical of Rauschenberg and his macho man size scale approach to artwork. Um, but in fact, after Rauschenberg's visit, here we are in 1989. Here is an example of Glexis Novoa's artwork. And this is actually a very big piece. And if there's any doubt, you can see here some pretty macho man size, to use his own language of criticism against Rauschenberg. Not only that, but notice the star. The star is this kind of unifying visual part of his painting. And I can't say definitively if this comes from Rauschenberg's influence, but it seems like a really wonderful example of, in spite of all those differences and obstacles confronting Glexis Novoa, it turns out that there was a cross-pollination taking place, one impacting the other, literally Rauschenberg signing his own poster, but now it looks like Glexis Novoa has absorbed some of that Rauschenberg arrogance or macho man size scale and is using it, as you see here, to kind of address this question of monuments and the decline of the revolution, the idea of monuments, kind of outliving, staying past their lifespan. And of course, this kind of anticipates the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, which will really be the main subject of our discussions moving forward. And in 1995, Novoa moves to Miami, and that's kind of the end of his era in Cuba. And you could see here, in terms of Rauschenberg, he sells his posters after he finishes his tour for $3,000. So, that's kind of a, the sad capitalist ending to Rauschenberg's story here, where he's literally selling these posters for $3,000. And of course, this honorary guest performance is a really important kind of update on the story with, as Dacia said, Fidel Castro looking almost like a ghost at this point. So why leave Cuba? Well, after the break, we will talk about that. And I don't know if we'll get too far into it because we're pretty far ahead. Went a little longer than expected. But let's take a short break and we'll kind of get our feet wet with this kind of era in the 90s, and I guess pick up where we left off next time. So unless there's any questions, let's take a short 10-minute break, or a 5 to 10 minute break. All right, let's pick up where we left off, but we're not going to go much more than another 10, 15 minutes just so I don't overwhelm you guys. But I think in the future, I should probably make the Rauschenberg lecture a standalone because it's clearly a lot to get into. So I just want to get our feet wet so that next class we can pick up where we left off, talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. On the left, we've got Mikhail Gorbachev, and on the right, we've got Fidel Castro. And even though it looks like a happy moment of solidarity, the truth could be anything but. This is actually a kind of show of union, of solidarity in the face of strain, in the face of extreme tension, which will lead to a split. And so, looks can be deceiving here. And so this is really the twilight of Fidel Castro's era in support of, supporting the communist, with support from communism, with support from the Soviet Union, which will very quickly, dismantle and fragment into the Eastern Bloc states become independent countries. And it's just sort of a domino effect of countries kind of spiraling and away from the Soviet Union. And of course, Cuba faces this dilemma of whether or not to, replicate what's going on in the Soviet Union. And as you probably know, Cuba will not offer any kind of perestroika or glasnost. Those are the names, the restructuring or the openness that characterizes this Gorbachev era of kind of shifting the Soviet Union towards a more capitalist kind of, I guess, political system. And Cuba will not adopt the same kind of approach. Of course, that means Cuba will be isolated economically, but for this kind of salvation of the Venezuelan government would have totally, I think, probably collapsed, especially because the U.S. embargo or blockade continues to isolate Cuba economically. Um, but I think the other saving grace is tourism. Cuba will turn to tourism as a way to get itself out of this period after the Soviet Union collapse, which is known as the special period. That's Fidel Castro's own term. Uh, as you can see from this interesting quote below, many people in Cuba weren't even aware of these changes going on in Soviet Union. Tiananmen Square is another example in China, people standing up to the government, and you really don't see the equivalent kind of confrontation with the government. The closest maybe you see is perhaps with performance art, and we'll see an example of that, and perhaps not today, but next week. I think this picture perhaps better captures the feelings of Fidel Castro at the time, where he looks like his face is betraying the reality of what's going on, understanding that Cuba is about to hit a major sort of storm of economic chaos. And so that baseball game we saw pictures of earlier are here. This is the moment when we have this baseball game where I think it's kind of the peak moment of performance art. Here you see the statue of David with a glove and a baseball mitt and baseball. Um, and sports is a really interesting subject too, because sports can transcend political differences, right? Sometimes politics will infiltrate sports. You see that with the Black Power fist raised in the Olympics in the 1970s, or even the guy taking a knee in sports in football. For some reason, I'm forgetting his name, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So, but otherwise, generally, sports is kind of a neutral territory, a place where you can put aside your differences, kind of like the uh, performances in Rome, ancient Rome, the circus, are a way to bring people together to watch some sort of event or have a common enemy. So here, using baseball to do a performance is very clever, very, I think very effective way of hiding behind the strength of numbers, right? And that's a very different approach to art than, say, something like this. Remember, Antonia Aidas's painting this got her into a lot of trouble because of the way it's portraying the average Cuban, a kind of grotesque, defeatist. Well, a baseball game is maybe another way of commenting on society or just bringing people together, but without the kind of with this the being so susceptible to scrutiny, the way an object of art, a painting that kind of addresses subject matter, Cuban subject matter in this way. And it's by one artist, one author, one object. You can't disappear and hide and vanish after the performance is over. So I think even Antonia Aides getting the award, the Felix Varela Award in the late 80s, part of this change going on, where the government's starting to atone for its past errors in the art world. And importantly, artists in the 90s, or the government in the 90s, and this is very important for you guys, starts to understand the real value of art as a way to promote the revolution and to basically cling to dear life in the face of all these changes. So the artists particularly become the best ambassador for the Cuban Revolution because one, they're sort of neutral territory, but also it's a way, it's one example where the Cuban government can say, look, in spite of all these other disasters, the Soviet Union collapsing, the lack of food, electricity, all these shortages that will come about in the 90s, look, the arts continue to be vibrant and meaningful and relevant. And so that's why the artists start becoming a privileged class. And also, you could say the beginning of losing a sense of perhaps that grassroots connection to the average Cuban because they become increasingly connected to the institutions and become spokespersons for the institutions. And then simultaneously, as we'll see later, you've got these street artists who are taking the art to the street, kind of like we see here down below with the graffiti, written on the wall. It becomes an outlet for self-expression in a time of great political scrutiny and paranoia, etc. So this is Berlin in the peak era of division in the 1980s, that wall literally defining a physical wall and a metaphorical wall, dividing the Soviet sector from the Western side. And that wall is a symbol of that iron curtain, or is that iron curtain separating two sides. You've got to love the European style here, the peg leg jeans, the what's called the stonewashed, and the loafers there with the white socks. Growing up, it was always like Europeans wear white socks, or Americans wear white socks, and Europeans wear black socks. I can't remember what it was, and now it's reversed or something very interesting to think about. But blue jeans are also a symbol of kind of Western consumption too. So this is definitely an age of the end of the Soviet Union, and Cuba calls it the special period. And well, what does that mean? Well, basically, this is what it means. Cuba depended on the Soviet Union for 70% of its trucks, 91% of fertilizer, 70% of iron, 74% of its grain, and 100% of its oil. So that's, a recipe for disaster if you're over dependent on one source of livelihood, right? So as in response, Cuba has to convert to bicycle technologies. It imports a lot of bikes from the China. It has to really recalibrate all facets of the economy, switch to these giant Wawas, these huge semi-trailer buses. You can imagine how hot they get in the summertime. They cut government ministries, cut defense spending by 86%. I think we can all agree that's probably good because no Cold War, there's no reason to have this heightened sense of danger. And of course, this also means tourism will become a major way of propping up Cuba in a time of crisis. So this is a very typical thing you'll see during this time period, blackouts, apagones mean blackouts. And importantly, there's a diminishing sense of loathing and antipathy for those who leave Cuba because the the standard of living declines so much that that kind of declines in proportionally to the sense of okay, it's okay to leave. So just keep in mind that kind of that balance shift to evening out where it's no longer you're not no longer seen as betraying the revolution if you leave Cuba because I mean you got to feed your family first and then you can feed Che Guevara if you will. So calorie consumption reduces by 27%. Imagine eating 30% less food every day, but not doing so because you're on a diet. So these are big changes. Seeing that this Wawa drive by right in front of that mural by Antonia Pelaez, Amelia Pelaez is a startling juxtaposition of two eras, right? People on horseback, people driving bikes. What's interesting for me is, and this is beginning of my interest in Cuba, because now basically I'm right around in college, your age, in the 1990s and 1996, and a lot of Cubans were coming to the United States on boats, as we'll see in a moment, the Balseto crisis in response to this, but also the environmental movement took real interest in Cuba because Cuba was doing things no one else in the world was doing with sustainable agriculture, shifting to organic agriculture, bicycle technology. And a lot of this seems really awesome from the point of view from the safety and privilege of the first world. And I say this almost with a kind of feeling like a little embarrassed because now we realize, and I knew it then, but especially now, it's not like Cuba was doing this because it was becoming more environmentally aware, but really just in response to a crisis and being resourceful. So this is kind of another chance to consider that the lack of congruity between the sort of Cuban situation and outsiders who want to project onto Cuba their own kind of wishful thinking, like, oh, look at what Cuba's doing great things, but you can't look at those great things without saying, wait, hold on, these are changes in response to a real humanitarian crisis. So a lot of interest in Cuba from the United States comes from kind of having solidarity because of left-wing solidarity, support for the government standing up to the United States, but at the same time, the more support that side shows, or that support comes, the more of that support that comes to Cuba, the more it kind of preserves the government's kind of authority and central authority. So and that also creates a very polarized sense of Cuba as either or, within or without, and there's not much room for gray area. And again, the Cubans are the first to suffer because of that lack of gray area, or the lack of space outside the revolution. And by that, I just mean like maybe the ability to start a business or to leave the country freely and come back. You can't, for instance, in Cuba in the 90s, I think starting in the 90s, but maybe before then, you weren't even allowed to get on a boat with tourists for fear that you might leave the country. So, there's a real sense of isolation that cuts deeply and deeper than just sort of your individual isolation, geographical isolation, political isolation, economic isolation. And of course, if you don't have religion to turn to or much civic involvement other than the revolution, it really makes the revolution seem everywhere. And as the value of the revolution declines with the lack of food, lack of energy, lack of resources, it makes that ever-presentness of the revolution all the more kind of insulting. Fidel Castro pointing, looking forward to the future, while you've got the present day kind of in a state of stagnation, is a real kind of remarkable contrast, right? Cattle, a lot of the cattle died because they couldn't feed them anymore because they weren't importing enough grain from the Soviet Union. And I think some of these pictures capture some of the kind of despair of this era. This, I think, is an outsider photographing Cuba. So this is kind of like a equivalent of a Robert Rauschenberg visiting Cuba, looking at it from an outsider's point of view. Of course, this takes place several years after Rauschenberg. And also importantly, if Rauschenberg, let's say he had been around at this time, I don't think the Cuban government would have wanted him taking pictures like this. So I think you still have to remember Rauschenberg wasn't a journalist so much as an artist looking, deeper and past and beyond other things. But of course, at the time of his visit, the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed yet. So it was a different era. And now in the 90s, you can, imagine these three people here. They all look like they're in their 70s and 80s. They could be in their 60s and prematurely aged because of circumstance. But let's say 70 upward. Well, they were definitely alive before the revolution. So they've seen life during Batista, then life during the revolution, and now life in this uncertain era at the end of the revolution, or not, dot, dot, dot. And, the phone there, almost like a connection to the outside world, but it looks like they're waiting in line, and really, down to their bone, their body is emaciated down to the bone. So these pictures, I think, really capture that sense of uncertainty. The tone is really spot on. And, the response of the Cuban government is to attract tourists to Cuba. And art is one way of attracting tourism. You can use the environment. That's a great way of attracting tourism. You can use culture. You can use sports. You can use some countries have sex tourism, I mean, sadly, and of course that was the case in Cuba before the revolution. Prostitution, a gambler's paradise. So in a way, Cuba does can could does in some ways veer back into that pre-revolutionary state, which is the ultimate, indictment against the revolution, the ultimate insult to people who weathered the storm of the revolution, only to reach this point where they're going right back to where they started. And other forms of tourism, like cultural, could include going to see art, collecting art. And that's why artists do become a kind of privileged class, because the government recognizes the value of art as a way of, extolling the virtues of the revolution, this time of crisis. But at the same time, you have so many people deciding, look, to hell with it. I'm done, suffering and sacrificing for the revolution. I am going to Miami. And that's why all these Cuban artists, or many of them, if not all of them, that we've looked at so far, decide to leave Cuba and go to Miami, pretty much Florida or Miami, maybe with some exceptions. But as you guys probably have observed, there's a lot of Cubans in Florida because they've escaped, or just left seeking a better life. And I mean, just look at the kind of makeshift boats people make to cross the Straits of Florida. And, it's just like, gosh, would you ever get on a raft across, 90 miles and something like this? And it just goes to show you the desperation people must have felt. I mean, just look at how skinny some of these people are, and think about the circumstances that would push you to, just put your life in danger in order to seek a better life. And of course, the history of the United States in a lot of ways is people escaping persecution, religious or otherwise. So this is kind of, this reality of life, and migration, just kind of escaping circumstances. But I think it's extremely severe in this case. And, I have to say, in the United States, it's, in the Clinton era, we kind of make things worse by incentivizing Cubans to do this because we offer this policy called wet foot, dry foot. Basically, if you land on Florida as a Cuban, you're given automatic citizenship. I think today you get like $1,000, and so you could say that's a good thing. But it also, you could say it incentivizes Cubans to put themselves into a lot of danger. So you can be critical of that too, as much as you might see it as a positive way of maybe leveraging power to convince the government to, uh, or maybe inspiring revolution. That's always very hard, sanctioning a country to get people to push people to a state of desperation where they rise up against the people seems a little cruel and mean-spirited. And yet that, of course, has been the kind of policy of the United States towards a lot of other countries, Iran, China, Cuba. And of course, the United States doesn't have an impeccable, human rights history either. So it's always get a little unfair to wag your finger at other countries when you should be pointing it at your own country with your own internal issues. So during the 90s, there's a real sense that Cuba might collapse, and the Brothers to the Rescue, who are a Cuban exile group, start dropping down these pamphlets against, anti-Castro pamphlets, anti-communism pamphlets. The Cuban government sends up some fighter jets to shoot down the plane. And instead of normalizing relations with Cuba, this basically leads to exacerbating relations with Cuba. And Clinton signs the Helms-Burton Act, which basically tightens the embargo and basically postpones any kind of normalization between our countries indefinitely. So I think this quote captures the spirit of this age. The Soviet Union helped us. So what happened? We didn't use the money to build a future. We became a country that created images in sports, in art, in conscience, in internationalism, in a series of things that are crazy in a country so underdeveloped. Now we don't even have toilet paper. So, that's a really powerful statement by this Cuban boxer. And I think it really is a great segue to art, which we won't talk about too much right now because we're reaching the end of class, but we can talk about this one performance piece as a bookend to our discussion performance by Angel Delgado, a very famous performance piece he does in 1990s. It says, La esperanza es lo último que se está perdiendo, which is hope is the last thing we're losing, right? And so here he is defecating, which is, to, the release, what I'm trying to say this politely, on top of the official Cuban newspaper, the Granma, which is the official publication of the state. So he's, basically using it as a bathroom, to defecate on top of the newspaper, which is, I can't think of a way to push buttons more firmly and more kind of visibly. And he does this in an art gallery. And so, this ties back to the idea of, not having toilet paper. And being forced to use kind of official publications to clean yourself, right? But it's obviously much more than that. He's, literally taking a dump on the institution. And as you can imagine, this is not well received by the government. And he ends up going to jail because of this. And in fact, I think the gallery manager is fired for allowing this to happen. He goes to art for six. He goes to art. He goes to prison for 6 months. And while he's in prison, he does make more works of art. And it becomes, and I think excrement becomes a symbol of this era, fitting symbol from this era. Excrement is like, you think about like the waste, that something you don't want to acknowledge, something that all of us do, but it's hidden from view. And of course, recycling as a response to the special period. So you can see how it becomes a very fitting, if somewhat, uh, you know, gross symbol for this time period. And of course, comedy. Choteo is like a joke, prank, or I think joke would be the best kind of a just translation. And so humor, the value of humor and symbolism or obfuscation replaces kind of performance perhaps as the main vehicle for confronting the government. And his work while he's in prison uses handkerchiefs to make these kind of small scale little pieces that I think make him turn him into kind of a hero, a champion of standing up to the revolution, but also creates a kind of warning for other Cuban artists that the age of performance, unlimited performance, is over, and you better be careful not to repeat what he did, or else you might end up going to jail for 6 months. And so, artists, I think, internalize that, and some celebrate what he did. Here is the artist, another artist a decade later, celebrating what he does. It does almost feel like a tribute to Rauschenberg. They said very good Rauschenberg. It feels almost like the Rauschenberg thing was kind of almost foreshadowing some of this. So it says here, artists and cultural workers too were plunged into a time of extraordinary hardship, mass defection, scarcity of materials, collapsing museums and cultural institutions, the end of government patronage. And so I think this picture captures that feeling of Cuba at the time. Their heart is in Cuba. Vocally, they're speaking up support of communism, but they're really thinking about going to the United States. And of course, it's Jesus, so it's a sacrificial Cuban. And I think that shows the conflict, the inner conflict that people feel at this time, between between having to publicly show support for Cuba, but privately feeling like it's time to go. So I think that's a good place to end. And we'll look at some other artists from this era, the 1990s, including Belkis Ayon. Maybe I'll just show you some examples of her work real fast. Really, really lovely. She ends up committing suicide. I don't know the circumstances, and it's something I'm still investigating. But her work is a wonderful, almost tribute to Wilfredo Lam, and she's visualizing scenes from Afro-Cuban religion, but doing so as a woman who's well aware that she as a woman isn't traditionally allowed into many of these male-dominated Afro-Cuban rites. So I think she is kind of visualizing these stories as a way to kind of reinvent Afro-Cuban religion and maybe get personalized, but also I think as an escape during this time of crisis and uncertainty. Some artists will flee into kind of subject matter that's maybe outside of politics. Others will do things like Angel Delgado did, which where he criticized the institutions by defecating on the newspaper. And so how far we've come from Antonia-itis now, and instead of an era of paranoia now the government is really reeling from losing a lot of authority, and artists have kind of an opening to either leave Cuba or to stay in Cuba and make the most of things. And I think the next era we'll look at, and the artists will continue to look at this era, all kind of represent this kind of fragmenting of that kind of within the revolution, and kind of this recalibration of everything, with some artists leaving Cuba, but the ones who remain will have to decide, well, if we remain, what is, we might benefit from the government giving us freedom to travel. But I think at this point today, a lot of the Cuban millennials, the ones who are, right before your generation, I think they're kind of realizing that they're increasingly, the more they benefit from freely traveling to and from Cuba, the more they become somewhat out of touch with the day-to-day concerns of everyday Cubans. So maybe the similar contrast might be between like a Damien Hirst and or Eric Fischl, or like famous artists, and Banksy, and kind of how one speaks to the institutions, art galleries and museums, and others about criticizing institutions. So on that note, we haven't quite got through everything, but we'll pick up where we left off next week. And I would say for your homework, just keep reading, catching up with your reading, and investigating an artist who you might be interested in writing about for your final paper, including seeing if there's any artists on social media, Cuban artists, who are going to social media to reach an audience beyond Cuba as a kind of coping mechanism with against the isolation that most artists in Cuba today feel, especially with the lack of tourism and the uncertainty facing Cuba. So on somewhat of a down note, we stop our lecture today, and we will pick up where we left off next week. Any questions for anyone about anything related to homework or otherwise? If I have anything I haven't graded outstanding, I'll make sure I get to that this week. But otherwise, I just say keep reading beyond where you got with laughing. I think that was chapter 2. And so keep reading into the next chapter, and you'll, I think, see artists who you might want to write about for your final paper.